The two princes stood on the bridge of their warship and watched the brown and gray world grow larger through the viewing screen. And Prince Valeth smiled with the confidence of someone who had never known defeat in his entire life. "Today we claim glory for the sovereignty," he declared to the officers around him. And his golden scales caught the light as he gestured toward the planet below. His brother Koreth stood behind him with his arms crossed and his expression far less certain. And he studied the tactical displays with the careful attention of someone who preferred knowledge over combat. "The reports say there are only 6 of them," Koreth said quietly, and his voice carried a note of caution that his older brother ignored completely. "6 human invaders on our territory," Valeth replied with a dismissive wave of his clawed hand. And he turned to face his warband commanders who waited for his orders. "We bring 200 of our finest warriors to crush them, and we will return home as heroes who drove back the human threat." The warband commanders nodded with eager agreement because they had trained their entire lives for moments like this. And they believed what everyone in the sovereignty believed about humans: that they were soft creatures from a moderate world who had somehow stumbled into space travel through luck rather than strength. Koreth had read different reports in the classified archives, but his brother never listened to his warnings. And their father, the Emperor, had sent them both on this mission to prove themselves worthy of their royal blood. The dropships descended through the atmosphere of Vara 6 with engines screaming, and 200 elite soldiers of the sovereignty poured onto the rocky surface with weapons raised and battle cries echoing. Across the barren landscape, Sergeant Park Gawan heard them coming from 3 kilometers away because the aliens made no effort to hide their approach. And she lowered her scanning equipment and turned to face her team with calm authority in her dark eyes. "We have company," she announced. And the 5 other members of Recon Team Dagger stopped their work immediately and gathered around her position behind a ridge of black volcanic rock. Corporal Yoon Hae-jin checked his communication equipment and frowned at the readings on his display. And he looked up at his sergeant with concern written across his young face. "I count 200 heat signatures approaching from the north," he reported, and his voice remained steady despite the odds they faced. "They are moving in standard assault formation and will reach our position in approximately 20 minutes." Private First Class Kwon Soo-bin adjusted the medical kit on her back and checked her sidearm with practiced efficiency. And at 23 years old, she was the youngest member of the team, but her hands never trembled orders. "Sergeant," she asked, and the others waited in silence for Park Ji-won to make the decision that would determine whether they lived or died on this forgotten world. Park studied the terrain around them and calculated distances and angles in her mind. And she had served in the military for 15 years and survived situations that would have broken lesser soldiers. "We fall back to the canyon system to the east," she commanded, and she pointed toward the jagged rock formations that rose like broken teeth against the gray sky. "We are not here to fight a war, and our mission is survival until extraction arrives." The team moved with silent precision through the rocky landscape as the alien warband closed the distance behind them, and they left no obvious trail but the sovereignty. Soldiers had tracking technology that followed their heat signatures across the cold ground prints. Valeth led the pursuit personally because he wanted to witness the capture of these human intruders with his own eyes, and he imagined the celebration that would await him when he returned home with prisoners to parade before the Emperor. "They run like prey animals," he laughed to his officers, and his troops spread out to encircle the canyon entrance, where the humans had disappeared into the shadows. Between the towering stone walls, Koreth remained near the dropships and monitored the tactical situation from a safe distance. And something about this felt wrong to him, but he could not identify the source of his unease. The first sovereignty soldiers entered the canyon with confidence and weapons ready, and they expected to find frightened humans hiding. behind rocks and waiting to surrender. Instead, they found nothing but empty shadows and a whisper of wind through ancient stone. Then the screaming began. The soldier fell with a hole burned through his chest armor from a shot fired from an impossible angle. And before his companions could react, two more collapsed beside him with identical wounds. Contact! Someone shouted into the communication network. And chaos erupted as the elite warriors of the sovereignty realized they could not see their enemy. Park Ji-won moved through the canyon like a ghost and fired twice more before relocating to a new position. And her team spread across the rock formations above and picked their targets with cold efficiency. The aliens had numbers and technology and the blessing of their royal commanders. But the humans had something else entirely. And that something was 15 years of training, designed to turn ordinary people into weapons that never missed. Velith heard the casualty reports coming through his communicator, and his confident smile began to fade. And he ordered more troops into the canyon to overwhelm the human position through sheer forsaken wrath. Watched the numbers change on his tactical display and felt his stomach tighten with the first hint of genuine fear. And he opened a channel to his brother with trembling claws. "Velith," he said urgently, "we have already lost 12 soldiers. And we have not even confirmed visual contact with the humans yet." His brother's response came back harsh and angry. And Velith refused to accept that 6 creatures could cause such damage to his elite forces deep in the canyon. Park Ji-won found cover behind a boulder and activated her emergency beacon. And she spoke into a communicator with the calm voice of someone who had accepted whatever fate awaited her. "Command, this is Recon Team Dagger," she reported as weapons fire echoed around her. "Contact with hostile forces, and we are outnumbered. And we request immediate extraction." The night fell over Vera 6 like a heavy blanket and brought freezing temperatures that would have killed most species within hours. But the humans of Recon Team Dagger moved through the darkness as if they had been born in it. Park Ji-won gathered her team in a narrow crevice deep within the canyon system and counted heads with quick efficiency. And relief flooded through her when she confirmed that all 6 members remained alive and functional. Status report, she ordered in a whisper, and her breath formed small clouds in the frozen Aryun. And He-jin pressed his hand against his left side where blood seeped through a hasty bandage. And he grimaced but kept his voice steady when he responded. "Took a graze during the last engagement," he admitted. And Kwon Soo-bin immediately moved to examine his wound with her medical scanner. "Communications are still operational, and I received a response from command about 10 minutes ago." The team waited in tense silence for him to continue, and the distant sounds of alien soldiers searching the canyon echoed through the stone passages around them. "Extraction denied," Yoon reported with a heavy sigh. And he met Park's eyes with an expression that mixed frustration with grim determination. "Reinforcements are inbound, but estimated arrival time is 14 hours. Private Choi Min-ho let out a quiet curse and leaned his head back against the cold rock. And at 31 years old, he was the oldest member of the team after the sergeant herself. 14 hours against 200 enemies, he muttered. And his grip tightened on his rifle. "I suppose we wanted a challenge." Park allowed herself a small smile that held no warmth. And she began calculating their options with the analytical mind that had earned her 3 battlefield promotions during her career. "We make them pay for every meter of ground," she decided. And her voice carried the absolute authority that only came from experience. "They expect us to hide and wait for death. And instead, we will hunt them through these canyons until dawn." The team divided into pairs and disappeared into the labyrinth of stone with practiced coordination. And they carried enough ammunition to make the sovereignty forces regret ever landing on this world. Prince Velith paced inside the forward command tent with growing agitation as the casualty reports continued to arrive throughout the night. and each new number felt like a personal insult to his royal honor. 30 soldiers. He snarled at his officers who stood before him with their heads bowed in shame. We have lost 30 of our elite warriors to 6 humans. And you still cannot tell me where they are hiding. Korath entered the tent with a portable data screen clutched in his scaled hands, and his expression had grown increasingly troubled as the hours passed. "Brother," he said carefully, and he knew how dangerous Valeth became when his pride suffered wounds. "Perhaps we should establish a defensive perimeter and wait for the daylight to resume our search. And our soldiers are not trained for night operations in unfamiliar terrain." Valeth spun to face him with fury blazing in his golden eyes, and he stepped forward until he towered over his smaller sibling. "You would have me cower in fear of 6 mammals?" he demanded, and his voice rose until the soldiers outside the tent could hear every word. "Father sent us here to prove our strength, and you suggest we hide like frightened children." Another explosion echoed from somewhere in the eastern canyons, and the communication system crackled with frantic voices reporting another ambush. And Korath watched as 2 more indicators on his tactical display changed from active to eliminated. "They are not normal soldiers," Korath insisted, and he pulled up the footage from a fallen warrior's helmet camera and showed it to his brother. "Look at how they move and how they fight, and these are not the soft creatures we were told about in our briefings." The footage showed a brief glimpse of a human female appearing from behind a rock formation and firing 3 perfect shots in less than 2 seconds, before vanishing again like smoke. And the image quality degraded as the camera's owner Caleb said. Valeth watched the recording with narrowed eyes, and his jaw tightened with stubborn refusal to accept what he was seeing. And he deleted the footage from the screen with an angry swipe of his claw. "They are merely desperate prey fighting for their lives," he declared, and he turned back to his officers with renewed determination. "Double the search parties and flood those canyons with bodies until there is nowhere left for them to hide." The soldiers obeyed their prince without question because that was what loyalty demanded. And another 40 warriors marched into the darkness of the black stone canyons with weapons ready and hearts full of confidence. Sergeant Park watched them come from her position high above the canyon floor, and she counted their numbers with cold calculation before signaling to Quan, who waited on the opposite ridge. The medic had proven herself an excellent marksman during the desperate hours of the night, and she had abandoned her usual reluctance to cause harm when the survival of her team depended on her rifle together. They opened fire on the exposed column of soldiers below and created chaos that sent the aliens scrambling for cover that did not exist. And by the time the sovereignty forces organized a response, the 2 humans had already relocated to new positions. "Deathworld demons," one of the alien soldiers whispered to his companion as they pressed themselves against the canyon wall, and his scales had gone pale with terror. The old stories were true, and humans are monsters wearing the faces of civilized beings. The whisper spread through the ranks like a disease, and soldiers who had fought with courage began to hesitate when shadows moved in the darkness around them, and every crack of a rifle sent them diving for cover rather than advancing. Valeth heard the rumors and felt his confidence cracking under the weight of 42 dead soldiers. And when dawn finally broke over the gray horizon, he stared at the canyon entrance with something he had never experienced before in his privileged life here and in the depths of the Blackstone Canyons. 6 humans shared their remaining water and ammunition and prepared for another day of war against an empire that still did not understand what it had awakened. The morning sun revealed the true cost of the night, and Prince Valeth stood before the rows of body bags that lined the forward camp with an expression that shifted between rage and disbelief. 60 soldiers had fallen during the darkness, and the survivors who stumbled back from the canyon looked like broken creatures who had witnessed something Their minds could not accept. Korath approached his brother with careful steps and held a fresh tactical report that contained numbers neither prince wanted to acknowledge. "We began with 200 elite warriors," he said quietly, and he kept his voice low so the remaining soldiers would not hear. "We now have 140 combat-ready troops, and we have not confirmed a single human casualty." Velith's claws dug into his palms until purple blood dripped onto the rocky ground, and his scales had lost their confident golden shine overnight. "They are only 6, he growled through clenched teeth, and his voice cracked with frustration he could no longer hide. "How is this possible?" Before Korath could respond, Velith turned to his remaining officers and raised his voice for all to hear. And desperation had replaced strategy in his mind. "Full assault," he commanded, and his words echoed across the camp like a death sentence. "Every soldier into the canyon at once, and we will overwhelm them with numbers they cannot resist." The officers exchanged uncertain glances, but obeyed their prince without argument. And 140 soldiers formed ranks and marched toward the black stone canyons with whatever courage they could gather deep within the stone labyrinth. Sergeant Parker G1 heard them coming and knew that the final battle had arrived, and she gathered her exhausted team for what might be their last stand. "They are committing everything," Yoon reported from his position near a narrow gap in the rocks. And his wound had grown worse during the night, but he refused to let Quan treat him until the fighting ended. 100+ heat signatures approaching from multiple directions. Park looked at each member of her team with steady eyes and memorized their faces because she understood that some of them might not survive the next few hours. "We hold this position," she declared, and she pointed to the elevated rocks that formed a natural defensive formation around them. "Make every shot count and trust the soldier beside you, Private Quan." Subin climbed to a sniper position overlooking the main approach and steadied her rifle against a boulder. And the medic who had sworn to preserve life now prepared to take as many as necessary to protect their wounded friend below. The first wave of sovereignty soldiers poured through the canyon entrance like water through a broken dam, and the 6 humans opened fire with deadly precision that turned the narrow passage into a graveyard. Alien warriors fell in clusters as they tried to advance over the bodies of their fallen companions. And those who made it past the initial killing ground found themselves trapped in crossfire from multiple angles. Prince Velith watched the carnage from a ridge above the canyon and screamed orders that no one could follow. And his perfect battle plan dissolved into chaos as the humans refused to die. "Grenades," an officer shouted, and explosive devices arced through the air toward the human position in desperate waves. Park grabbed Yoon and pulled him behind cover as the explosions shattered the rocks around them, and debris rained down like deadly hail that cut and bruised but failed to kill. Sovereignty forces pushed forward through the smoke and dust, and finally the battle became what Velith had wanted all along. A close-quarters engagement where numbers should guarantee victory. Private Choi Minho met the first alien soldier with his rifle butt and shattered the creature's jaw, before spinning to shoot another who tried to flank him, and his movements flowed like a deadly dance that left broken bodies. In his wake, Quan abandoned her sniper position when 3 soldiers climbed toward her and engaged him hand-to-hand with a ferocity that shocked the aliens into hesitation. And she used that hesitation to end them with her combat knife. Prince Korath had demanded to observe the assault personally, and now wished he had stayed at the camp, because what he witnessed in that canyon changed everything he believed of the universe. He watched Sergeant Park G1 fight with blood streaming from a wound on her forehead and 3 cracked ribs that should have left her screaming in agony. And she moved through the enemy soldiers like a force of nature that could not be stopped by mortal weapons. "Impossible," he whispered as she broke an alien's arm and used his own weapon against his companions before discarding it and continuing with her bare hands. "These are not soldiers. These are something else entirely." The battle raged for 2 terrible hours until the canyon floor was covered with purple blood and broken bodies. And when the survivors finally retreated to regroup, they left behind another 80 of their companions. Velith ordered the capture of the wounded humans at any cost. And the squad managed to overwhelm Yoon and 2 others through sheer numbers, while Park and Quan fought their way to freedom through a gap in the encirclement. 140 elite warriors reduced to 60. And still 3 humans escaped into the deeper canyons to continue their impossible resistance. Korath found his brother sitting on a rock with his head in his hands. And for the first time in their lives, the younger prince saw the older one looking truly afraid. "We captured 3 of them," Velith said without looking up. And his voice sounded hollow and broken. "Perhaps now we can end this." But Korath knew in his heart that capturing 3 humans would not save them from the wrath that was coming. Because somewhere in those canyons, 3 more remained free, and somewhere in the void above, human reinforcements were getting closer with every passing minute. The captured humans knelt on the cold metal floor of the command tent with their hands bound behind their backs. And despite their wounds and exhaustion, they looked up at their captors with defiance burning in their eyes prints. Velith circled them like a predator examining prey. But the confidence he tried to project felt hollow after what he had witnessed in the canyons. "You will tell me the location of your main force," he demanded. And his voice carried a desperate edge that undermined his attempt at intimidation. "How many more humans are hiding on this world, Corporal Yoon?" Jin laughed despite the blood that stained his uniform and the pain that throbbed through his wounded side. And the sound echoed through the tent with genuine amusement. "Main force," he repeated. And he shook his head slowly. "There is no main force. And what you see is what you get." The leaf struck him across the face with enough force to split his lip. But the human simply spat blood onto the floor and continued smiling. "We are Recon Team Dagger," another captured soldier explained with weary patience. 6 people sent to map terrain and catalog resources, and that is all. And there was never anyone else. Korath felt the words hit him like a physical blow. And he stepped forward with his datapad clutched tightly in his trembling claws. "What exactly is a recon team in your military structure?" he asked. And his voice wavered with a fear he could no longer hide. Yoon met the prince's eyes with something that might have been pity. And he spoke slowly so the aliens would understand every word. "The smallest operational unit in the Terran Defense Force," he answered. And he watched the color drain from Korath's scaled face. "Just scouts. And we gather information and avoid combat whenever possible." Korath turned to his portable terminal and accessed the captured human military database they had obtained through intelligence channels. And his claws trembled as he searched through the organizational charts with growing horror. A standard infantry squad contains 12 soldiers. He read aloud, and his voice grew weaker with each word. A platoon contains 30, and a company contains 150. Velith watched his brother's reaction with confusion that slowly transformed into understanding. And the implications began to crush the last remnants of his pride. A battalion numbers 800 combat soldiers. Korath continued, and he had to stop and catch his breath before he could finish. And the nearest human rapid response fleet carries a Marine expeditionary force of 15,000 ground troops plus orbital support capabilities. Silence fell over the command tent like a funeral shroud, and every officer present began to comprehend the magnitude of their miscalculation. "You lost 140 soldiers to what we consider a minimal presence," Yoon said quietly, and there was no mockery in his tone now. Only the honest delivery of terrible truth. "We were never meant to fight you, and our entire mission was to avoid detection and gather data." Velith staggered backward as if struck and caught himself on the edge of a table. and his golden scales had turned a sickly pale shade. "If 6 scouts could do this," he whispered. And he could not finish the thought because his mind refused to imagine what actual combat troops would. Dockereth pulled up more data with shaking hands and found the combat footage archives from human military engagements across the galaxy. And what he saw made him want to close his eyes and pretend he had never looked. Human Marines in powered armor moving through enemy positions like unstoppable machines, and human special forces eliminating targets with surgical precision that made his elite warriors look like untrained children, and human naval vessels reducing entire defense platforms to dust with weapons that defied comprehension. "Why have they not conquered everyone?" one of the officers asked in a voice barely above a whisper. And the question hung in the air with desperate hope for an answer that would make sense. The captured humans exchanged knowing glances, and Yoon answered with the simple truth that the sovereignty had never bothered to learn, because we do not want to rule anyone, he explained, and his words carried the weight of centuries of human history. "We fight to protect our own, and we ask only to be left alone. And every species that has attacked us learned the same lesson you are learning now." Outside the tent, a communication officer burst through the entrance with panic written across his features, and he struggled to form words as he pointed toward the sky. "Long-range sensors have detected incoming vessels," he gasped, and his scales rippled with primal terror. "Human military signatures approaching at combat speed." Korath checked his display and felt his heart skip simultaneously when he saw the fleet size. And 12 warships with enough firepower to glass the entire planet were dropping out of faster than light travel at the edge of the system somewhere in the canyons behind them. Sergeant Park Ji-won heard the distant rumble of atmospheric entry and allowed herself to smile for the first time in 2 days. And she turned to Kwon and the other survivor with fierce determination. "That is our ride," she announced. And she checked her remaining ammunition with practiced efficiency. "Now let us go get our people back." The sky above Vareth 6 filled with fire as human dropships screamed through the atmosphere in perfect formation. And the 60 remaining sovereignty soldiers watched their descent with the frozen terror of creatures who understood they had already lost. Prince Valeth shouted orders that no one followed because his officers had abandoned their posts and fled toward the extraction ships. And his voice cracked with desperation as his command dissolved around him. "Hold your positions," he screamed into a communication system that no longer responded. "We are warriors of the sovereignty, and we do not retreat." Korath grabbed his brother's arm and pulled him toward the command tent where their prisoners still knelt under minimal guard. And his survival instincts had finally overcome his loyalty. "We take the humans as hostages," he insisted, and his voice trembled with barely controlled panic. "They will not fire on their own people, and we can negotiate safe passage." The first dropships touched down 3 kilometers to the east, and their doors opened to release streams of armored figures who moved with terrifying coordination across the rocky terrain. Sergeant Park Ji-won watched the deployment from her hidden position and counted the Marines with professional appreciation. And the cavalry had arrived in force that made her heart swell with pride. 200 in the first wave. She observed to Kwon and Private Noah Yoonji, who crouched beside her. With more dropping every minute, Kwon checked her rifle one final time and nodded toward the command tent in the distance. And her eyes held the fierce determination of someone who would die before leaving a teammate behind. "Noon and the others are in that tent," she said, and her voice carried no fear. "We move now while the aliens are distracted." The 3 humans descended from the ridgeline like shadows given form, and they circled behind the sovereignty camp while every alien eye focused on the approaching Marine Force Prince. Valeth positioned the captured humans at the entrance of the command tent and raised his voice toward the advancing Marines. with what he hoped sounded like authority. "Stop where you are," he demanded. And he pressed a weapon against Yoon's temple with shaking claws. "These soldiers die if you come any closer." The Marine advance halted at 200 meters, and a figure in officer's insignia stepped forward with measured calm that seemed impossible given the circumstances. "I am Commander Baek Sung-hoon of the Terran Defense Force," the officer announced, and his amplified voice carried across the camp with cold clarity. "Release my people unharmed, and you will be allowed to leave this world alive." Valeth laughed with desperate bravado and tightened his grip on his hostage. And he believed that the threat of human deaths would give him leverage. "You are not in a position to make demands," he shouted back, and he gestured toward the kneeling prisoners. "Lower your weapons and withdraw your ships, or these scouts die where they kneel." Behind the command tent, Park AG-1 signaled her team into position and prepared the final assault that would end this nightmare. And she whispered coordinates into her communicator for the Marines to create a distraction. "On my mark," she breathed. And her finger tightened on her trigger. Commander Baek raised his hand. And exactly 5 seconds later, a barrage of smoke grenades landed around the tent and filled the air with thick white clouds that blinded the alien guards. Park burst through the rear of the tent with Kwon at her shoulder, and they moved through the chaos with lethal efficiency that left 4 guards dead before anyone could react. Yoon felt familiar hands cutting his bonds free, and he looked up to see his sergeant's bloody face smiling down at him with fierce joy. "On your feet, Corporal," Park ordered, and she pulled him upright as the rest of the team freed the other prisoners. "We are leaving." Prince Valeth spun toward the commotion and raised his weapon. But Kwon was faster, and her shot took the gun from his hand before he could fire. The smoke cleared to reveal the full might of the human force surrounding what remained of the sovereignty camp. And 200 Marines with weapons ready formed an unbreakable perimeter around the 60 survivors. Kurath dropped to his knees and raised his empty hands in surrender. And he was the first alien to understand that resistance meant certain death. "We yield," he called out, and his voice carried the broken sound of someone whose entire worldview had crumbled. "Please, we yield." Commander Baek approached the kneeling prince with measured steps and studied him with eyes that held no hatred, only the tired wisdom of a soldier who had seen too many unnecessary battles. "You attacked a survey team," the commander stated, and each word fell like a hammer blow. 6 unarmed scientists mapping a dead world, and you brought 200 warriors to crush them. Korath lowered his head in shame and could not meet the human's gaze. And beside him, Valeth trembled with the humiliation of total defeat. "If 6 of our scouts could do this to your elite forces," Baek continued, and he gestured toward the body bags that littered the camp. "What did you imagine would happen when you faced actual soldiers?" The question hung in the air without answer, because no answer existed that would restore the honor the princes had lost hours later. The sovereignty survivors boarded their damaged transport under human escort, and they carried with them a message sealed with the authority of Terran High Command. Kareth held the data chip that contained that message, and he knew that delivering it to the Sovereignty Council would change everything his people believed about the galaxy. "Tell your leaders what happened here," Commander Baek said as the transport doors began to close, "and tell them this was a recon team, so they should pray they never make us send soldiers." The transport lifted off and disappeared into the darkening sky, and Sergeant Park Yi-won watched it go with her team gathered around her on the rocky ground. "Sergeant," Yoon said quietly, and he leaned against Kwon for support while the medic finally treated his wounds. "Do you think they will listen?" Park considered the question and remembered all the empires throughout human history who had learned the same lesson. And she shook her head with weary certainty. "They never do," she replied. And she turned to face the sunset with her surviving team beside her. but we will be ready when they try again, across the galaxy. The Sovereignty Council watched the combat footage in stunned silence as two broken princes delivered their warning. And for the first time in 1,000 years, the masters of a stellar empire felt the cold touch of genuine fear.